So let me kick off by introducing our guest this evening. Ben, it's wonderful to have you with us. Welcome. Ben Habib is a highly successful businessman operating in the finance and property arena and has been a long-standing, ardent and articulate Brexiteer. Originally a Conservative Party member and donor, he stood and was elected as a member of the European Parliament for the Brexit Party in 2019, citing in particular Theresa May's failure to deliver Brexit as his reason for entering frontline politics. In 2023, he was made Reform UK's co-deputy leader. He stood as the Reform candidate at the Wellingborough by-election in February 2024. First sign, perhaps, that Reform UK were a genuinely real, serious electoral force. He got a good chunk of votes in that by-election, about 13%, I think, and then actually increased his vote share in that seat in the July 2024 general election to north of 20%. But 2 days after the general election, he was replaced by Richard Tice as Reform's deputy leader. And in November 2024, Ben quit Reform UK, citing concerns about the democratisation process of the party, which he felt had not taken place, and also said that he had something of a disagreement with Nigel Farage's claim that Brexit had been done or completed. He has gone on the public record to say he would not rule out rejoining Reform, and he continues to be one of the most articulate public intellectual commentators, if you like, from our broad ideological side of the ledger on television programmes and in print across the UK. Ben, wonderful to have you with us. How the devil are you doing, sir, this evening?
Well, thank you very much for that fantastic write-up, Mark. I'll come on as frequently as you will have me with that sort of write-up. Thank you. No, I'm very well, thank you, and very much looking forward to this chat.
Great. And let me, in anticipation of the sort of questions you might ask, I'll try and interweave these into the conversation that Ben and I are more generally having. But the sort of topics I'm intending to cover are Southport, grooming gangs, the first day or so of Donald Trump, the strengths and weaknesses of the Conservative Party, the strengths and weaknesses of Reform UK, and what might some rapprochement or unity on the centre-right look like if we are determined to get rid of this ghastly Labour government at the first opportunity? So let's start, Ben, with the big picture things rather than the party politics. I've seen quite a lot of your commentary today on Southport. You were on the Jeremy Kyle show. This is, gut-wrenchingly ghastly, as obviously as an incident. But what do you think this whole episode tells us about the state of our politics and our judicial system?
So, the event itself, needless to say, is abhorrent in the extreme. Girls, I think there were 6, 7, and 9, were they, the 3 girls who got killed, and a whole host of others seriously injured. I think the ones who were killed, as I'm sure people who are listening would have heard earlier today when the judge was describing the case, stabbed 122 times, an attempt to decapitate the 6-year-old. This was an absolutely horrific crime. And, if there was ever a case to put someone down for what they'd done, this was it. But I suppose from a political perspective, what's remarkable about it and what we need to look at in terms of going forward with surety is not to blame Amazon for selling this individual a knife, which as far as I'm concerned is a complete deflection. You can pick up a very sharp kitchen knife from anyone's kitchen. You don't need to go to Amazon to get a killing weapon. It's those who wield the weapon that cause the death. And the real takeaways here for me are that we have undoubtedly, in my view, a politicized criminal justice system. The way the truth must have been known to the Prime Minister. The truth of the crime would not have affected at all the judicial process. Some aspects of the crime eventually came out, the fact that he was in possession of ricin and Al-Qaeda workbooks, but it took months for that to come out. The Crown Prosecution Service asked the police to keep some of the evidence secret, and the Prime Minister actually went on record and again, deflected people from the truth, describing this individual as a Welshman, which colloquially to any sensible minded person conjures up an image of a farmer at peace with his sheep, somewhere out in the rural parts of Wales. And it took months for the truth to come out. And in the process of the truth coming out, he then went on to politicize and categorize and direct the criminal justice system against what he called the far right. He categorized those who were protesting as the far right, directed the criminal justice system against those individuals, and threw the book against them. And one individual, a chap called Peter Lynch, who had done nothing more than shout at the police and put some conspiratorial words on a placard, was convicted for 2 years and 8 months and hanged himself in prison because he couldn't cope with the experience. And so we saw a politicization of our criminal justice system, first in hiding the identity of Ruda Cabana and what they must have known about him straight away, and then in the way that protests were dealt with. And all I take away from that is that there's an ideological bent in this country at the highest level, which is in support of progressive discrimination, in support of diversity, equity, and inclusion, in support of mass migration, and it will not allow anything, even the most blatant, horrific facts, to intercede and correct that mistaken ideology.
Okay. The awkward role that I have in these sort of conversations, Ben, is we're joined by such sound, right-thinking guests that I'm in the uncomfortable position of having to play devil's advocate and trying to put forward some sort of defence for the Prime Minister's actions. What would you, and I agree that he's not been even-handed. It seems absolutely fine to label people far right, but not to explain what we know about Al Qaeda manuals being in this man's bedroom and the like, and describing him as a Welshman, whilst might be technically true, seemed to me a deflection point. But do you think a case can be made in the Prime Minister's defence, although it did not pan out this way, that he was worried if the facts of the case became known immediately after the murders, that would actually incite violence and riots and the like? And if he could keep a lid on that for a while, then perhaps civil unrest would not break out and the full details would come out in court and justice would be done. Now, that would have turned out to be a misjudgment, of course, because there was considerable civil unrest. But do you think there's any chance that we could give him the benefit of the doubt, and that being the thought process that was being gone through? Because obviously the information was going to come out at some point, right? So might it have just been the case that, oh, crikey, if we release this now, we'll have the British National Party and God knows who burning down mosques. Let's try and keep a lid on it, delay it till trial. Justice will still be done. Or am I being far too generous to our Prime Minister?
I think you're being far too generous, Mark. I think the best way to have coped with it was to have come out and called this man out, or this adolescent, called him out for precisely what he was, disclosed the facts to the extent that they were available to Merseyside Police, Yvette Cooper and himself, and said this: the full force of British law will be applied to this individual, and we will take steps to prevent this from ever happening again, including revising our incredibly lenient approach to mass migration, the whole agenda which provides protection for these individuals rather than protection for civil society in this country. And I'm going to put the government's protective blanket round the British people. Do not fear. This is a wake-up call for the government, and we will change direction in the way we govern our country.
Mm-hmm.
I will deal with this. That's all he had to say. And his, apart from anything else, his support in the polls would have gone through the roof. People would have been settled. Communities would have understood precisely why it is he said what he said. And people like me wouldn't have been on the airwaves even then, calling him out, saying, what the devil is going on? Why won't you disclose the truth?
Yeah, and the whole it's Jeff Bezos's fault because of the way that Amazon distributes products does seem like another deflection to try and get away from the underlying problem, doesn't it, Ben? Now, you've mentioned, I think you've alluded to, but I wanted to explore your issues further, probably the reintroduction of the death penalty in the United Kingdom probably isn't quite within the Overton window of practical policy discussion. But I think a
No.
case like this does make it, people start to question whether it's appropriate in crimes of this type. And actually, Valerie Coker says many people think that crimes like the massacre of children should mean the criminal should be executed. Should we bring back the death penalty for some specific crimes? Angela Hughes has the same sort of question. Does Ben believe the death penalty should be brought back for certain wicked crimes such as this? Worth saying, I think I'm right, and in the few Western democracies that have the death penalty, it's rarely applied to those who commit a crime under the age of 18, which has also prevented this monster from getting a whole life sentence without parole. But do you think it's going to open up on capital punishment, possibly, Ben, but certainly on severity of punishment? Are we going to see the Overton window shift about punishment in Britain, especially for the most egregious of offences?
So I think the Overton window needs to shift a hell of a lot before we even get to being able to discuss capital punishment. The Overton window at the moment is stuck in a place where we're not even able to enforce our borders. Preventing people from entering our country illegally seems somehow to be abhorrent to those that govern us. And unless we have a nation state which is defined by its borders, and if those borders aren't enforced, we don't have a nation state. Unless we have a nation state which is protected by borders, we won't have a civil society. And so I think the debate is a much more fundamental one. Do we recognize that borders are important? Do we recognize the nation state of the United Kingdom? Do we care for the protection of our citizens over and above, and if necessary, to the detriment of people seeking to come into this country, particularly those coming illegally? Do we have that kind of belief? And that, for me, is so obvious what the answer to that is. It's so obvious that it absolutely startles me that our entire parliamentary representative democracy isn't completely behind what I've just said, but it isn't. And so to be discussing capital punishment is to be going over, so many standard deviations from where the norm is at the moment. I mean, I do think we should have a look at it. I'd be very careful about capital punishment. We were a settled, integrated, extremely civilized society. I think we're heading away from that sort of settlement that we had, certainly when I was an adolescent and a young man. And I would like to get us at least back to that position. And then, we can discuss perhaps these other more controversial issues.
Well, I suppose, I don't know whether this is on a similar theme, really, Ben, but it's on a similarly grim theme, and I think raises some of the same questions about how our policing, judicial and political system operates, is the scandal of the child rape gangs. I won't call them grooming gangs. That sounds
No,
like
they're rape gangs, yeah.
grooming gangs makes it sound like you're involved in some kind of equestrian sport. I mean, this is the
Yeah.
mass rape of children. Something, if you like, similarly seems to have gone wrong here with,
Absolutely.
with people, our masters and overlords not being honest about what's going on, not wanting to confront it, fear that it will, undermine the sort of diversity agenda or God knows what, or will provoke civil unrest. I mean, this is an unbelievable scandal, what's happened here. I mean, I think this dwarfs even things like the horrors of the Post Office Horizon scandal. This is
Absolutely.
absolutely unbelievable. And I don't have much confidence that justice is going to be done here. I don't just mean for the precise perpetrators. I can imagine, and it's difficult without having the full evidence, but at first blush, that we should be looking at hundreds of state officials having custodial sentences for the way they've behaved.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
Any chance we ever get there? Or is
Yeah,
this
so I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, our country is in a position. So I'm just going to reverse a second. It rolls off our tongues. We say we live in a liberal democracy, and that is regarded without question the right place to be for the United Kingdom. But liberalism and democracy act in tension against each other. Liberalism, but at the risk of saying the obvious, is the promotion of the individual's rights. and democracy is the promotion of the majority's rights and interests. And what we've had over the last 20, 30 years in particular is liberalism on steroids, where the right of the individual has been promoted to the point where they can identify as a woman, they can decide that they want to be a dog, or they can have any kind of culture they want. If you come to this country, it doesn't matter that you hold views that are antipathetic to British values and British culture. We will put a protective blanket around you. We'll progressively discriminate in your favor. You have an absolute right through our liberal nature to hold all these wretched views and values and so on, and we won't challenge you. And that has basically undermined our democracy. This is a massive discussion, and there are many other things that have undermined our democracy, but this liberal approach has undermined our democracy. And in the pursuit of this liberalism, in the fear of being accused of being racist, because you might identify that there's a particular South Asian minority that are involved in these gang rape gangs more than any other component in our society, in the fear of being called racist or xenophobic or whatever it is, our criminal justice system again failed us. Our social services failed us. Our local councils failed us. Some of these girls were traded in community centers. They were sold into sexual, torturous slavery in community centers and councils. And the J report, which the government keeps pointing to and saying, well, we had this J report, its recommendations were never implemented. The J report explicitly says on page 13, if people want to look it up, that there's been no account taken of ethnicity or background in the perpetrators of these crimes. And so the J report is wholly useless when it comes to identifying what caused these problems. And the Quilliam report of 2017 is quite revealing. It does say that when it comes to individual rapes, actually ethnicity is broadly proportional to the number of rapes perpetrated. But when it comes to gang rapes, it is predominantly South Asian men, mostly of Pakistani origin. And if we can't face up to these truths, if we can't have an open discussion because we're hijacked by the DEI progressive discrimination agenda, and when you couple that with mass migration, we are looking at national failure. That's what we're looking at. So you're quite right to say it's a hell of a lot worse than the post office scandal, which was horrendous. But it's a hell of a lot worse than that because we're looking at the collapse of our country. That's what that gang rape thing. And isn't it remarkable that it took a foreign billionaire to get this debate going?
Yeah.
And Labour are still in denial. And so when you combine Labour's denial over the gang rape gangs, their refusal to have an inquiry, and Starmer's approach to Ruda Cabana and the way he castigated and categorized all those people as far right and directed the criminal justice system at them, there are far too many dots that join up far too easily for us to reach any conclusion other than we have a government that simply has lost the plot.
Yeah. With regard to Elon Musk, if this is what the intervention of foreign billionaires in British politics looks like, I'd like more of it, please.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot more of it, because our country and our politics owe him a great deal of thanks, I think, for accelerating this up the agenda by raising questions about it. Again, Ben, I wanted to tuck into this bit. I think the statistics you were referring to, I can't remember them off the top of my head, about the ethnic profiling of child abuse that's been used sort of suggests that there isn't a problem with particular ethnic groups. But it glosses over an enormous issue here, that if you look beyond these horrible gangs, most child sexual abuse happens within the family and within the home. And obviously we want to stop that. But that's a much bigger challenge for the authorities, right? Than some sort of gang when the young girl easily, or the father of the victim, goes to the police. So, to my mind, the big difference here, obviously, I want all child sex abusers caught and punished, is the collusion of the authorities. And I don't think there is a suggestion that the authorities generally collude with the horrors of child sex abuse within a family. But here there seemed to be collusion, might be putting it too strongly, but sort of willingly turning a blind eye seemed to be the normal modus operandi.
They didn't have the courage to stand up to it. They didn't have the courage to call it out for fear of the progressive discrimination order that, you've got to protect and promote other cultures and so on. There's a flip side, without wishing to moved, far on in the conversation. But there's a flip side to this, and I see it as this: it's the breakdown of families as well. It's these girls becoming vulnerable because we've lost, and this is the other, or it's another aspect of how our democracy is failing. Families are being broken down. The tribe that is British is breaking down. And these girls are becoming vulnerable because in many cases in our families, we've abdicated the responsibility of bringing up our children to the state. And the state is particularly poor at bringing up people. We need to reimpose families, uh, communities, and again, coming back to it, the nation state. And all of this is democracy.
Yeah,
The family is at the heart of democracy. And the state has interfered too much in our families. And these girls became vulnerable. And they became vulnerable to a group of individuals, which, again, through state regulation and sensibilities, our authorities weren't prepared to challenge.
yeah, yeah. I'm with you. I think this idea about liberalism and democracy, and you want a mix of the two. I can see that you
Absolutely.
want rights to be protected, against an authoritarian majority, but at some point, liberalism makes you so open-minded you don't keep anything in, I think.
It has to be in healthy tension. And we've got a very unhealthy tension where democracy has been set aside. And without boring everyone rigid, the ultimate end of liberalism is dictatorship. And on en route to dictatorship, what happens with liberalism, in order to promote the individual against what the majority want, the only way you can do it is by shutting down free speech.
Yeah,
And that's what we're seeing as well, Mark, isn't it? We're
yeah,
seeing repeatedly the shutting down of free speech because in order to protect the individual, you've got to tell the majority to shut up,
yeah, 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 yeah.
basically, haven't you?
Now, underlying all of this, I want to come to a question from Craig Smith. Good to have you with us, Craig, who says, as a proper Conservative, I've been deeply concerned about our party's mishandling of immigration in recent years. With new leadership now in place, how do you believe we should proceed to implement a fair, effective, and sustainable immigration policy that restores public trust, respects our borders, and meets the needs of our economy? So what would the sort of, I mean, we've got, it's now one of the top issues of salience in voters' minds. I don't know, the economy, I think, often comes out number one, but it's always a strong second, even if it's not number one itself. What's the right approach to this immigration issue now? And I mean, I agree with the broad brush principles that you've painted, Ben. We need to have secure borders. We need to know who's coming in and out. But what's the overall structure of an immigration policy that would look sensible? I mean, I don't believe there's no one else should come in. I mean, if Elon Musk wants to relocate his businesses to Swindon, I'd welcome him with open arms, right? So we need to have some sort of principles in place that allow immigration to happen, but also allow us to properly secure our borders and have some sort of audit of who's coming in and what their contribution is, to ensure they're net contributors rather than all net beneficiaries.
Yeah. So immigration, as we used to practice it in the 1980s, was of a sort where we used to wish to welcome, and I think mostly did, highly educated people who brought expertise, know-how, academic contribution, commercial contribution, and were aspirational, wanted to, had a massive hurdle over which to get to leave their countries if came from, say, Pakistan or whatever. They had to really prove themselves worthy of coming to the United Kingdom. And so we got quite a good immigrant. And even though I'm half English, my mother's blonde, blue-eyed, and born in Isleworth, and my father is from Punjab in Pakistan. I was born in Pakistan, and I came here when I was 13, and I'd count myself as a good immigrant because not good because I behaved well, which I did, by the way, but a good immigrant because I love the United Kingdom. It's my mother country. It is literally my mother country.
Mhm.
And I buy in not just into its values, but its culture. And I believe that I have a duty to contribute to the society in which I live. That was a form of immigration, I think, broadly that we practiced back in the 70s, 80s, and the early 90s. And then Blair came into office, and he saw the nation state as basically the enemy of the individual because all people should be equally important. British citizens should have no greater claim than anyone else, and we had freedom of movement and so on. and our nation states slowly became degraded. And and then Boris Johnson must have been asleep at the wheel, I'm afraid, and threw open the doors to mass immigration of just about anyone.
Hmm.
And we've had 4.5, 5 million people come to the United Kingdom in the last 5 years, most of whom come from cultures and backgrounds which are not similar to ours, and most of whom are not aspirational, not well qualified, don't add anything to our academic or commercial social, academic, social, and commercial fabric. They add nothing. Many of them come here and they're on benefits, and they hold our culture in antipathy. Some of them come from war-torn countries for which we are responsible, like Libya, Iran, not Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. They come here with
Hmm.
antipathy to our country, and we've welcomed them in. And in the process, we have damaged greatly our culture, and we have damaged greatly our economy. The notion that somehow GDP is going to go on going up because we're getting more people in is a false one. GDP has flatlined, and GDP per capita has gone down for the last 12 quarters. So we've had a recession, a very protracted per capita recession for a very long time because
Yeah.
of mass immigration. And the other impact of it, of course, is when you get cheap imported labor, massive supply of it, you undermine wages in the United Kingdom. So what we've also seen is that it hasn't made sense. I know people say, oh, well, the Brits don't want to work. I think I know this is going on YouTube, but there's only one word in response to that. That's bollocks. It's not that the British don't want to work. It's that a fair day's earnings don't translate much more than what you would get on benefits. Benefits has become almost a career choice. The gap between net earnings, the net median wage after tax, and the maximum you can get from the benefit system is not that large. It
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
an economically rational decision to say I'll take my benefits and watch Netflix all day. And
Yeah.
you see that in the numbers. So there are 3.3 million people now claiming mental health issues, not even looking for a job, living on benefits. That figure was 2 million a year ago.
Yeah.
There are 6 million people on universal credit. There were 6 million people on universal credit a year ago, 7.2 million now. Um, and before lockdowns, there were only 3 million people on universal credit. What we've seen is a complete breaking of our labor market. And in
Mhm.
many senses, Mark, that's more worrying than the massive level of debt we've got, the massive level of taxation, because the United Kingdom literally is not working at the moment. We need to swallow a bitter pill. We've got to wean ourselves off cheap, pointless imported labor. And we've got to slash benefits. We've got to be ruthless on slashing benefits. We've got to cut taxes on the working and middle classes so it pays the work. And we've got to reboost our economy. Basically, we've got to do what Trump is doing in the
Yeah.
United States. We've got to
Well,
secure our borders and promote our own workforce.
yeah. And I mean, amazingly, at the moment, just on the economics of it, not the culture of it. Now, I'm trying to recall which cohort it was. I think it's immigrants coming in the last 2 years, but it might be the last one. Only 16% of them are actually in the labour market. And a good chunk of those 16% who are in the labour market, I mean, some of them will be in very highly paid jobs, but a good number of them will be in very lowly paid jobs. So even though they're in the labour market, will be net beneficiaries. So we seem to have stumbled upon an economic strategy in which we are importing vast numbers of net beneficiaries every year and exporting vast numbers of millionaires. More
I
millionaires are
know.
leaving the country than any other country in the world other than China. I mean, you're only a few steps away from becoming like Venezuela if you continue to behave like this, because the public finances cannot sustain that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I read yeah, sorry, go on.
I was going to say my sort of solution to this. I know it doesn't tackle the cultural issue, which I think is a rather more nebulous one. You can't quite put numbers on it. I'm not quite sure what my sort of citizenship test would be. It's not as easy to mathematically formulate. But on the economic side, what do you think of this? It's a rather blunt instrument and it might require a bit of nuance. But if you were to take the total cost of government in the UK and divide it between the 70 million human beings who are on these islands, the cost would come in at £17,250 per person per year. So in my view, that's the membership fee. if you want to come over to, I don't know, study medieval poetry at some university with your wife and 3 kids, fine by me, all things equal, but it will be £17,000, £250, £250 a year each, please. You might be able to write that off against income tax, fine. So if you're actually earning a ton of money, but that is basically the membership fee. And if you are not able to pay that membership fee, I think it's questionable on immigration. I mean, asylum's a little different, whether we want you in the country at all. So why don't we just make it plain as day? I don't really care whether
Yeah.
you're working or not, by the way. I mean, you might be a multi-millionaire who wants to retire here. Fine, if you can pay your own way. I guess most people will pay their own way by working. But why don't we, as I say, I appreciate it doesn't really sort out the cultural side, or it might do as a side effect, but why don't we just put a price on it?
Yeah, so I mean, I haven't done the numbers and reflected on the impact of what you said, but what you said prima facie makes great sense. If there's a particular cost for you being in this country, you should at least pay that cost for the privilege of being here. And
Mhm.
thereafter, we can have a discussion what else you might need to do. I mean, it might be that we want twice that just because, you're coming in, you're joining the club. There should be an application fee too, right?
Yeah.
And what are you bringing in with you? And I mean, all of that. But the culture is critical for our economic prosperity. And the reason I say that is, we're all now accustomed to seeing the Bank of England, for example, the other day saying that a background in finance is not important. We're more interested in people from different
Yeah.
backgrounds. MI5, MI6, and GCHQ recruiting interns only from ethnic minorities. The
Yeah.
RAF recruiting fighter pilots based on their ethnicity. All of this is deeply damaging to our security, our economy, our ability to protect and promote British citizens. And we've got to wake up. As you say, we're going to be Venezuela if we're not careful. And,
Yeah.
I think a lot of us labor falsely under the illusion that, oh, it'll all be all right. We'll muddle through, stop being so extremist and hyperbolic and scaremongering. Everything will be fine on the night. Well, that's kind of worked so far, but there can be no guarantee that that will continue to work. We've got to do something dramatic. And I think what Trump is showing us, perhaps moving the conversation on, but what Trump is showing us is the agenda that needs to be adopted. And it's terrific that the largest democracy in the world is now adopting that agenda. The most powerful country in the world is adopting that agenda. And frankly, Mark, without wishing to move the conversation too far ahead, if we don't get on that bandwagon, we will
Mhm.
find that even more bright people will leave the United Kingdom for the United States. Our capital will leave this country to pursue investments in the United States because energy is cheaper, taxes is lower, regulations are easier. And we will see a further exacerbated denuding of our economic prosperity. We've got to, Starmer needs to stop shuffling off to Paris and Munich and Berlin to try and get succor from his European partners. He needs to get his arse over to Washington and do a lot of brown nosing and make up for all the detriment of his colleagues and himself over the last few years.
I agree, Ben. So great segue. I want to, we've been a bit miserabilist in the first half hour of our discussion. So let's move on to Trump and be a bit more optimistic. We've actually got a poll that people can vote on. I'm interested to know whether those gathered. Obviously, our audience here is not reflective of the UK population, but how are you feeling about Donald Trump's new administration? Very optimistic, somewhat optimistic, don't know, somewhat pessimistic, or very pessimistic. Apparently, Ben and I are the only people who can't vote, so I'm going to close that little panel on my window, but we'd like to hear how you're feeling. I would be, if I did have the vote, in the very optimistic category. I mean, talk about hitting the ground running, right? And very different, worth saying, to 2016 when he first became president. It seems, at least in the early hours of his presidency, that there is a plan and a playbook, and he was pretty clear what he was going to do on day one and what he's going to do on day two and the rest of it. How impressed have you been by the first 24 hours or so, Ben? And how hopeful and optimistic are you for the United States under this Trump 2.0 administration?
So I'm very hopeful. 100 executive orders signed on the first day, setting out precisely the direction of travel for his administration, including wanting to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, which, is so Trumpian, but it
Yeah,
sends a message, doesn't it? It
yeah,
is America. Now, the agenda he set out is an agenda that I have been effectively, and I'm sure you have, Mark. I've watched you on GB News saying things very similar to what I would say. Um, it's an agenda we've all been kind of campaigning for. We all kind of want it. But he has shown that the greatest nation, the most powerful nation in the world, is going to deliver it, or is seeking to deliver it. And in the first instance, if he does succeed in doing it, actually, it's going to be quite challenging for the UK, as I intimated, because if we don't get on that bandwagon, we will lose wealth, we will lose more rich people. So it's going to be painful for us to watch Trump do what he does if we don't join him. And so we need our political class to wake up to the direction of travel and get on that bandwagon. The only concern I have, I suppose, and one has to always temper one's optimism with a degree of, reality, is that there will be challenges to his executive orders. There will be court cases. There will be, and all sorts of impediments put in his way because we know that's the way the organism behaves when the organism is required to change. But
yeah.
at least he's set the wheels in motion, and I hope what it will do will give Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage more courage in coming out more stridently on the right-hand side of politics, which, by the way, is where the vast majority of British people are. They're not centre ground. The next election, I'm moving on. The next election won't be won in the centre ground. It's going to be won by those who espouse an unashamedly pro-British, small state, small c conservative vision of the
You're,
United
you're,
Kingdom.
you're channeling the great late Keith Joseph, Ben, that elections aren't won in the centre ground, they're won on the common ground. And those are very, very different places, actually.
Yeah.
And actually, the most successful politicians tend to get the centre ground to move to them rather than the other way round. Just a few thoughts. Again, I'm trying to find some notes of optimism, and I agree the United States of America is definitely one of those. Um, Duncan Booth asks, there's a sort of comparison between Biden and Starmer here, perhaps, and that's sort of echoed by Martin Hodges, who says, like Biden and Trump, do you actually sort of need a weak left-wing administration in order to bring about a reset? Anthony Murphy asks, should we declare a state of emergency as Trump has done on the southern border, or I guess for our entire border, in order to deal with immigration? I mean, you often say in politics and in life, the darkest hours before the dawn. And I appreciate history doesn't repeat itself, but is this a bit like 1974 and then potentially the rise of Thatcherism to save the nation, that you kind of needed the Keynesian Butsk-like big state consensus to sort of be tested to destruction before it was possible to reset? And, although I very much hope we don't have to go through the agony of, colossal strikes and IMF bailouts and winters of discontent, perhaps, unfortunately, those are necessary prerequisites to a radical shift in direction, that until the sort of social democratic, progressive, globalist paradigm, whatever you want to call it, has been, doubled down on several times and still found wanting, which it seems to me exactly what's happening. But that needs to occur for there to be an appetite and an uprising to do something completely and radically different. And I wonder if that's potentially going to happen here and has happened in the United States of America. I mean, one of the clips of President Trump from his inauguration speech, which, I obviously applaud him for, but I was scratching my head thinking, if 30 years ago you'd been able to get into a time machine and go forward to this speech, how weird would you find it that amongst the president's first words are, there are only two sexes, male and female, and he gets a round of applause for it? I mean, I'm glad he said it, but it sort of spoke to me more of how mad the world has gone, that this needs
Yeah.
to be in the opening remarks of a new president of the United States rather than something we all take for granted. But on that wider point, do you think that sort of the Starmer administration is akin to either Biden or perhaps Wilson Callahan? And now they're attempting everything to destruction, and unfortunately the country will suffer. But that might be the backdrop in which there becomes widespread political appetite for a real shift in political direction. Not just the sort of retail offers of cutting tax and the rest of it, but a complete reboot of the institutional infrastructure of the United Kingdom. And it seems to me that you might need some sort of disaster to trigger the appetite for that.
Well, I think you're absolutely spot on. And the fact that I'm on this screen at the moment is purely because I fear that the United Kingdom is facing an existential threat. I think Western civilization is facing an existential threat. I think we've so lost the plot that if we're not on the edge of the precipice, we may actually already be over it. And let's hope the landing, if we are over it, is not a death blow. We need to find our feet very, very urgently. And, we saw, it's a small point, but we saw in December the third largest borrowing requirement by the government ever in December. And it's testimony to the collapse of the United Kingdom. And I don't know if you've ever watched Alan Clarke's Civilization or read the
Oh
book.
yeah.
It's a fantastic series. One of the things Alan Clarke says, it resonates with me, it sort of lives in my head, is that civilizations build for the future. When you
Mhm.
stop building for the future, when you don't have new great buildings being produced, you're probably at the end of civilization. And you look around the United Kingdom now, we don't produce anything of note. Nothing like the Mall or Pall Mall rather, or St James's Street, or those great buildings that we take for granted as we walk through central London. We don't build anything like it. We're lucky to get 15 boxes on a 1 acre site outside Swindon.
Yeah.
And you know what I'm saying. And another part of that is complete disconnect with logical thought. Another symptom of the end of civilization is that disconnect. So, for example, having to say, President Trump, as you said, having to just redefine for the sake of clarity what a man and a woman is. It's because our civilization has been so hijacked, we're struggling to even identify that which is a woman, which
Yeah.
is a great tragedy for someone like me, because I think the greatest spice and pleasantness that I've experienced in my life is the fairer sex. And if I can't clearly define and identify who they are, then I'm personally in deep trouble.
I
And
couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Just to take the temperature of the audience here, we've got the poll results back. Just a bit of fun, just a bit of fun. Not suggesting this is representative of the wider population, but asked how you're feeling about the new Trump administration. 78% of you say very optimistic. 14% of you say somewhat optimistic. Sorry, 16% say somewhat optimistic. 4% don't know. 2% of you are somewhat pessimistic, but 0% of you are very pessimistic. So a pretty big thumbs up for what we've seen so far and hope for the future. And if you're interested in exploring a bit more about what we could expect from Donald Trump and the Republicans over the coming years, in the chat box right now, you can sign up for our next Pop Conversation, which is at 7 p.m. next Tuesday with Greg Swenson, who's the chair of Republicans overseas here in the UK. And he's going to tell us what we might see from Trump, what it might mean for all of us. We've seen quite a lot of action already. Ben, I want to move on in this final section to considering how do we practically bring this about in the United Kingdom. So you have previously been a member of the Conservative Party. You were then at Reform UK. You then left Reform UK. I'm trying to think. I think you might have left Reform UK. Was it on the same day that Tim Montgomery joined Reform UK? I can't.
Andrea Jenkins.
Andrea Jenkins, that was right. It felt a bit like football transfer deadline day. It was kind of, Reform UK signed Jenkins. Ben Habib's now a free agent. It was
no reflection on Andrea. No
no.
reflection on Andrea.
But let's start with the Tories, because PopCon seeks to be ecumenical. But if you like, our starting point, without being adamant or brutal about it, is that probably the Conservative Party is by and large the best vehicle for bringing about this sort of change. What's your, just to give you my, it's got lots of failings about it, the Conservative Party, a huge number, but it does have 121 MPs to Reform's 5.
Yeah.
It did beat Reform UK by 10% of the vote at the last election. It's still neck and neck with Reform, roughly, in the opinion polls. It's got 5,000 councillors to Reform's 50 or whatever. I mean, I'm not trying to poo-poo the efforts of those in
No,
the
no, 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 no.
state, but that's my
These are
rationale.
fact. Yeah.
Therefore, that sort of looks like, if you're trying to get to more than 326 MPs, that the Conservative Party is either that vehicle or a big chunk of what needs to happen. What's your audit, Ben, on the general strengths and weaknesses of the Conservative Party, and in particular Kemi Badenoch and her first, what is it now, 2.5 months, 10 weeks or so in office?
So I would have wished the Conservative Party to have been conservative and done what was needed in order to reverse Blairism and to set the country on a safe path. I would not have wished Reform ever to have existed. Frankly, I would have wished the Conservative Party to have been the party that I grew up believing in. You know, I voted Conservative all my life until 2019. And even 2017, I voted for Theresa May, believing that she would deliver Brexit and that she actually believed herself, you know, that which she said. The Conservative Party, if I can just go back one step, the Conservative Party had a great connection with the British people. In the 1950s, it had 2.8 million members or something, apparently. And through that connection, it had obviously the ability to canvass and secure future mandates. But it also had a mechanism by which it could choose candidates extremely well, and it could have a deep connection with where the British Conservative mind was.
And was
And I think
embedded in the local community much more. You know, your local
absolutely.
Conservative
So
Association
you
would be
had
a big part of civil society. Yeah.
there was a great connection between the party and the people, and that has been hollowed out over time. And I think it's only got 130, 140,000 members. And I think that's been part of the problem with the Conservative Party. It lost touch with
Mhm.
the British people. It's lost touch with the mood. And when it came into office under Cameron and successive administrations, it conserved that which it inherited, but it made no attempt to restore. And restoration was vital. One of the mistakes I think Reform makes is to see everything through a Reformation prism. Actually, what we need to do is repeal, 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 and take us back to a position which was a much happier one, I think, in the early 90s and 80s. And sadly, the Conservative Party didn't repeal and it didn't reform. It just conserved that which it inherited. It needed a genuine good kick up the backside, and it's got that kick. And I hope Kemi will d- d- come out encouraged by what's happening across the Atlantic and rediscover conservative roots and understand the importance of restoration of our country. When Lee Anderson says in his own way, I want to take our country back, my interpretation of that is the restoration of our democracy, our institutions, and our social fabric, taking us back to where we were when it was a much more comfortable period. And that, by the way, is not looking over my shoulder at sunny uplands that have gone. That's
Mhm.
just taking us back, you know, constitutionally to the place that we need to be. So
Yeah.
I'm hoping Kemi will do that. Um, and that would be terrific. Nigel, for those who are watching and think of Nigel as a firebrand, more capable of moving the Overton window, prepared to take risks with saying risky things, I'm afraid he's not actually that man. Nigel, I think, has been speaking absolutely frankly. I think Nigel has been slightly cowed by 20 years of being that man. And if you see Nigel's behavior now, he's actually tacking quite considerably to the middle ground. And I think it's a big mistake for reform. It's, apart from anything else, from a party political perspective, it opens up a massive gap which Kemi can fill. So Nigel is on the record saying he's not concerned about the rate of demographic change. Whereas Kemi is on the record saying that she is concerned about the rate of demographic change. And of course, that's important. And there are many other examples I can give you. But what I would wish for the centre ground, for centre right politics now, is to rediscover genuine small c conservatism, to understand that it's as much about restoration as it is about reform, or more about restoration than it is about reform, and to have a genuinely bold, brave agenda. Don't worry about the mainstream. Come out bold. And the people want it. That's what they want. if Kemi were to come out, or Nigel were to come out, Nigel hasn't got there yet, but if Nigel were to come out with Trump's policies, or Kemi were to come out with them, they would garner the support of the British people.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you on that. Just as a until we come back to the big overarching mission, just on a kind of nuts and bolts point, one of the key thing that PopCon argues for is this great restoration, that we need to actually get back to the way the Constitution worked. David Starkey talks about our need to put forward a great restoration bill as soon as we're back in Parliament. I, not having David Starkey's brains, say it's a bit like finding a virus on your computer or something wrong with your computer. You switch it off and you switch it on again, and you hope it goes back to the reset that was actually previously working. But we also push for a considerably more democracy in the Conservative Party. That, you know, okay, yeah, the membership is enormously smaller than it was in the 1950s, say, but that, you know, local associations should have considerably more power on who they select as candidates, that the candidate selection process shouldn't be about promoting a particular ethnic group, age group, you know,
Absolutely, my
minority group.
goodness, yeah.
And although CCHQ central office has some sort of role in vetting candidates to make sure, you know, you haven't got a criminal record, or you're not a Holocaust denier or some such like. Once you've kind of got through those loops, let the local association decide. Don't present them with a short list of one in a safe Conservative seat at the last minute. So we push for that. And I actually think, in addition to, you know, whichever of Nigel and Kemi come out with the most impressive platform and the most dramatic platform on restoration, the actual way that their machine works is going to matter as well. Now, one of your key reasons for leaving Reform, and I do ask this of people in Reform, I'm very fond of Nigel Farage, and, you know, in an ideal world, I think the three of us would all be in the same political party. But is it a dictatorship? I mean, is it? We, even the Conservatives, often argue that there's too much, you know, power on high. But is that even more so true in Reform UK? It's a one-man band in terms of control, even though it has a hugely impressive ability to see its membership tracker dial up and fill halls of people waving the Union Jack and singing God Save the King and all of the rest of it. That was one of your key reasons for departing, right?
Yeah, so, and I think it's a failing. It's a fundamental failing in reform, that it stands for the democracy that is the United Kingdom, but won't democratize itself. It wants us to trust the people of the United Kingdom to direct its governments, but it won't trust its own membership to direct its leadership. And you know, I think intellectually and philosophically that's fundamentally flawed. But also, if you're not democratized, you lose touch, as we were discussing earlier, with your base. You lose touch with those that are informing you in the leadership about where the people's mind is. And reform is a dictatorship. Absolutely. I've got to call it out for what it is. It is a private limited company with shares, 15 shares, 60%, 9 shares of which are owned by Nigel. And the constitution, which he waived at the conference that they held on the 20th of September, doesn't actually deliver democracy, because any mechanism by which checks and balances are put in place, or leadership can be removed and held to account, because it only gives one very blunt tool to the membership, which, by the way, are not members yet, because Nigel is the 60% shareholder. But if and when they ever become members, it gives them a very blunt tool, and that is that if more than 50% of them request a vote of no confidence, then that vote of no confidence will be considered by the board of directors of the company, of which there are 8, 5 of whom are appointed by Nigel.
Right.
So there is no mechanism for change. And, you know, Zia Youssef and Nigel both said they would democratize the party. They haven't. And I've been patiently, actively, but patiently waiting for that, actively campaigning, but patiently waiting for it to happen. And it hasn't. They also said they would produce branch networks, which themselves would be democratic. And actually, the rules of the branches were released a couple of months ago. And Rule 3.2, which, after you've got through the definitions, is actually the second rule, says that you must take directions from headquarters. So there's no democracy. They're
Right.
not allowed to have bank accounts. They're not allowed to propose candidates. They have to, so it's all top down with
Yeah.
reform. And I think what Nigel is concerned about is entryism, being taken over by malign forces. But there are mechanisms to prevent that from happening. And
Yeah.
whatever the Conservative Party is, sorry, I'm probably laboring this too much, you want to go. But whatever the Conservative Party is, it's an ancient institution. And however flawed it is, and I do agree that it needs, I think the CDO's work, the Conservative, what was it called? The Conservative,
Democratic Organisation.
yeah, I think that was moving in the right direction. But it
Yeah.
is nevertheless an ancient party, and it has checks and balances in place, and it is an organism which, having had the kicking that it's had, I hope will wake up and rediscover itself.
But it may be that the Conservatives have made it slightly too easy to get rid of our leaders. Here's a stat to conjure with. Since the Brexit referendum, the average tenure of a leader of the Conservative Party has been 680 days.
Yeah.
The average tenure of a Premier League manager is 750 days. So you survive even less long as Tory leader. But reform may have made it impossible. But a number of people, Ben, ask you, so Chris Calvert and Susan Renshall ask you, what might convince you to join the Conservatives? Susan actually asked what might convince you to lead the Conservative Party. But others ask what might convince you to rejoin Reform. So as I say, you're an independent free agent at the moment. Are you enjoying that, or do you want to get back on the front line? And if so, in a blue rosette or a teal rosette?
So I don't believe Nigel's going to democratize reform. And I think without some checks and balances in place and the ability to create a broad, deep, capable team at the top of reform, I don't think it can't go beyond where it is. And whatever Richard Tice was when he was leader, and a lot of people said he wasn't all that charismatic, he couldn't command people the way Nigel can, blah, blah, blah. What Richard did understand was that he had to build a broad and deep team. And that's what he was doing. And Nigel's come back and it's just Nigel Farage. And that, I think, is a problem. And if he doesn't change that, there's no way I'm going back to reform. The game at the moment, Mark, and for the next 3 years, is a battle between the Tories and reform for the polling numbers in the country and for the grassroots and membership and canvassers and so on. Nigel is unashamedly coming after Tory members, Tory MPs, Tory councillors, because he knows that he can't create it organically. And so what Kemi needs to do is to make sure that she holds on to her members, her councillors and her MPs, and that she takes succor and confidence from what's happening across the Atlantic, takes succor and confidence from the many polls in the United Kingdom, which have, in my view, beyond all doubt, shown the British people to want proud, independent, sovereign United Kingdom. Make that the centerpiece of her thinking and restore the United Kingdom. Go there, and actually, then I think the Conservative Party will see reform off because Nigel won't democratise.
That's
and if
really
she
interesting.
can take the ground,
So I want to finish on a couple of polls and your closing thoughts, Ben, about the possible relationship between Reform and Conservatives. And I agree, we're a number of years away from a general election, sadly. So we're going to have this ghastly government until 2029, most likely. And I agree that we'll probably get, if you like, I don't know, 2 or 3 years of shadow boxing, you might say. And, at the moment, Reform's had a pretty good time in the polls since the election, and the Conservatives have flatlined. But there'll be by-elections, there'll be local elections, there'll be mayoral elections. And you can imagine, I suppose, a scenario in which one does knock out the other. I think it more likely that Conservatives would knock out Reform, but I'm no forecaster of the future. But you can also imagine a scenario, can't you, where 2 or 3 years down the line, we are still looking at national opinion polls, which are something along the lines of 25% Conservative, 25% Reform, 25% Labour, a scenario in which the Labour government could conceivably get re-elected on a quarter of the vote. So we're asking people in this poll to what would you like the Conservative and Reform relationship to be going forward? Do you think the two parties should merge? Should they continue to fight each other? And I'm particularly looking at that sort of 2029 general election. Presumably, Ben, if we were to get to that, I mean, I bumped into Zia Yusuf last night at the GB News studios. I've never met him before. and fair enough, but he was hugely bullish. He thinks that after this sort of shadow boxing, Reform are going to knock out the Conservatives. Well, maybe he's right. But if we actually get to a stalemate, surely country before party on both sides needs to be what we need to recognise and do, because kicking out this government is going to be an absolute national priority in 2029, and you can't play sort of games about who said to whom. So do you think there could be that coming together if you don't get one side scoring a technical knockout against the other?
So whatever Zaya Youssef and Nigel say, I know Nigel, and I know precisely what is in Nigel's mind, even though he hasn't told me. And his aim is to set up the best possible negotiating position he can between now and 2028 for the Conservative Party. Take as many Conservative MPs, grassroots members, canvassers, councillors, whatever. Take as much of the Tory party as possible. Weaken the Tory party as much as he possibly can. Get to 2028, and then he will try and do a deal. And then and if he succeeds in becoming very strong, he'll do that deal from a position of strength. If he doesn't succeed in his mission, he'll try and do a deal from a position of weakness. But I know that is precisely where he's going. And Zaya and Nigel can say as much as they like that that's not their aim. I know that's how Nigel is thinking. And Kemi needs to recognize that. She needs to recognize that that's what their game plan is. And if she wants to protect and promote the Conservative Party, she needs to make sure that that plan is neutered. But if you get to 2028 and everything is 25, 25, 25, as you say, then it would be utter madness if Nigel and Kemi didn't sit down and have a chat and make sure that we got rid of the Labour Party and that we got a true small c Conservative Party putting nation first, putting our country first.
Yeah. We also asked people what they think might happen in the future. Now, I agree with you on that, Ben. And that doesn't seem to be an unreasonable strategy from Farage. I don't know what's going through Kemi's mind either. I would have thought that the Conservatives, will the same sort of thing. We'll try to see them off and, or make them a rounding error. And if we can get them down to 8% of the vote, it would be a bit like, the Green Party presumably takes votes off Labour, but it's a bit of a rounding error. But would you be confident that common sense would prevail? I mean, that's a really interesting insight to Nigel Farage, and seems to me a perfectly sensible way for him to do business, really. We don't
I agree with all of what I think is perfectly sensible. I mean, why wouldn't you do that? It's very difficult for him at the moment because he doesn't have the base that he wants. And all those new members that he's got, that remember, they're not new members. They are subscribers and they're paying 10 quid and there are no checks on who signs up. You may want to go on and test the system yourself. So it's all a bit arbitrary, all of that. So I think it's a perfectly reasonable approach for Nigel to take, and we'll just see where this ends up.
Yeah. Because, I mean, let's sort of end on an optimistic note, Ben, for all of the, people, well, especially nerds like me, studying the detail that comes in from each and every opinion poll and every local council by-election result to see what to see what the way the world might be going. I think there is emerging a common narrative on the centre right, not embraced by absolutely everybody in Reform and everybody in the Conservative Party, but and also I think embraced by a good number of people who are now in no party, like yourself, around everything that's gone wrong, the need for a great restoration, the insanity of carbon net zero that we haven't even touched on, the need to reset our judicial system, the need to get politics out of our legal system. And do you think if we end up on a common narrative, it makes all of this coming together in some form, merger, pact, one party assimilating the other, enormously easier? If the two manifestos are side by side, or the draft manifestos are side by side and incredibly similar, then it would be petty-minded not to try and find some working relation.
Yeah. And also, Mark, just going back to what you said earlier in our conversation, things are really bad. We are facing, I think many people would accept, an existential threat. And facing this existential threat, it would be lunacy not to come together. You can't be party political when the country needs to be saved. You've got to do what's right. And so we'll just have to survey the landscape, the political landscape in 2028, and decide what's the best way to make sure the country is saved.
Yeah.
And I hope, if I'm able, though I'm not making any decisions now, but I hope, if I'm able, to be in an in the in a position where I can make an electoral impact by the time we get to 2029 or the next general election.
So, and do you think that, I mean, a bit of advice to me, I guess, Ben, is if we can try and get people from both parties and none, but who are broadly sympathetic to these ideas like you are, shouldn't a big role of PopCon just be to simply try and get people round the table, round the same room, onto the same Zoom calls, to put aside the raw fights of the electoral landscape and, you know, what's going to happen in a putative by-election in Runcorn, but to actually see whether we can sort of come together and agree these broad principles by
Yeah.
putting away our rosettes and wearing no rosettes at all. And if that sort of intellectual, policy, philosophy, strategic synergy happens, a lot more falls into place.
I absolutely agree. It's time to do that. And even if we don't do it in public, it should be taking place in private.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Well, let me finish by what people have said they want to happen with regard to reform and the Conservatives. And I don't know the mix of Conservatives and Reformers and Independents in our audience. I think it's very disproportionately Conservatives, but in the spirit we were just discussing, Ben, we welcome Reformers as well. 10% want a merger, 33% want an electoral pact or alliance, 33% want some form of working relationship, even if it presently falls short of an electoral pact or alliance. Only 7% say we should contest everything under two separate banners, come what may, and the remainder don't know. I'm a bit in the don't know category, is that I don't really care what the form of any future arrangement is. And, you know, ultimately, I don't really care how we get to this government. I tell everybody that however badly Southampton Football Club do, I will still be a fan, even if that, and a season ticket holder, even if they're on the Beezer Home Leagues Division 9, which the way they're playing at the moment, they shortly will be in the Beezer Home Leagues Division 9. But my support of the Conservative Party or any electoral vehicle is sort of tactical. It's you know, how to actually bring about change in the country. What do you think might happen? What the prediction of what people think will happen? 13% think a merger will happen, but an alliance, 52% believe that will
Yeah.
happen, against 35% who think that Tories and Reform will continue to fight to the death. So, look, Ben, thanks for joining us. I just wonder whether we should finish on it. We've overrun our time a little, but just on an optimistic note. It seems to me that in these dark times on these islands, even if things look a bit brighter across the Atlantic, and actually in some circumstances across in continental Europe as well, I think
Absolutely.
there are changes there that we should welcome. We seem to be not quite the last standing woke liberal, you know, mad progressive pseudo socialist government, but pretty close to it in the Western world. Are you feeling pretty optimistic that these might be a few dark years, but our best days are yet to come?
You know, bizarrely, I am feeling optimistic. I don't know why I say bizarrely, but I am feeling optimistic. And I felt pessimistic for a long time, but I'm feeling optimistic. And I think I do take a lot of confidence from what's happening across the Atlantic. I do take a lot of confidence from what's happening in Europe. Of course, they've got proportional representation, which is a daft system. So that means even if you do win the popular vote, you can't actually form a government. And I take great comfort from the way the British people have voted. Actually, you know, if you look at the last five plebiscites that we've had, including the referendum, the EU elections in 2019, and so on, every single time the British people have wanted small c conservatism, a proud independent country. Even in the 2024 general election, there
Mhm,
was no popular support for Labour. They got
mhm.
fewer votes in 2024 than they did under Corbyn in 2019. It's just that so many people are pissed off with our governing classes that they didn't vote, and so I think there's real hope going forward. And I think things may get worse economically. We may suffer, but I think we're going to get a good economic and cultural kick up the arse from the United States. I hope the Conservative Party's already had a good kick up the arse. And I hope Reform can also take courage from what's going on across the Atlantic and not pivot too far to the centre ground in order to curry favour with other voters. And that we emerge with something that saves the country. And as you say, it doesn't matter what the vehicle is. The vehicle, whatever it is, needs to deliver for the country.
Ben, just before I thank you for what's been a brilliantly entertaining and informative last 70 minutes, just a couple of reminders for our audience. I've already mentioned our next online pop conversation will be with Greg Swenson of Republicans Overseas UK to talk through this upbeat, optimistic view we all have of the United States under Trump 2.0. The link is in the chat for that. Following that, on Tuesday, the 4th of February at 7 p.m, I'll be joined in another pop conversation by GB News presenter Tom Harwood, discussing the current state of politics and, of course, the current state of the media in the UK and practicalities and principles of the centre-right. I think there could be a link in the chat there. There's a link in the chat there as well. And I can reveal now that actually on February the 10th, Monday, February the 10th, we will have a pop conversation at 7 o'clock in the evening with Lord Dan Hannan. Details of that and the Zoom link will follow. If you are not signed up to our weekly newsletter, why on earth not? The link is in the box, and you'll get a newsletter from us every Friday on upcoming events. So please make sure you're signed up. And please do, if you haven't yet joined the PopCon opinion panel, where we survey you about every 2 or 3 weeks on tactics, strategy, and beliefs, we'd love you to join. We've had more than 150 of you, I think, joining us throughout this call and this conversation. So thank you very much for your input. Sorry, as normal, I can only get through a dozen or so questions, but I tried to batch them together as good as as well as I possibly could. Ben, it's been an absolute pleasure. We must meet properly face to face very soon, rather than
Thank you.
over Zoom. It's been brilliant to hear from you. Thank you for your insights, your analysis, and I think most of all for your optimism, Ben. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon. Over and out.